There is something underneath your feet right now that no one has fully explained. Not as something that doesn't show up on any official map, doesn't appear in any government survey, and in some cases has been quietly sealed off, roped away, or simply declared off limits without anyone ever explaining exactly why. Across North America, in places you would never expect, beneath cities and deserts and dense forests and open plains, there exist tunnels. Passages cut into the earth or carved through solid rock, some of them stretching for miles, some of them opening into chambers large enough to hold hundreds of people, some of them lined with markings that don't belong to any known civilization, and some of them discovered by accident when the ground above them simply collapsed without warning. Historians call them anomalies. Archaeologists use phrases like unexplained subterranean formations or pre-contact earthworks of uncertain origin, which is a careful academic way of saying we have absolutely no idea who built these, when they were built, or what they were for, and then they move on to the next topic. But some researchers haven't moved on. Some people have spent decades crawling through these passages, mapping their dimensions, photographing their walls, taking samples of the stone and the soil and the strange residues left behind on the floors. And what they found doesn't fit neatly into the story we were all taught about who lived in North America before Europeans arrived. The story we were taught goes something like this. Before Columbus, the Americas were home to various indigenous peoples living in relatively isolated communities. Some built impressive surface structures, the mounds of the Midwest, the cliff dwellings of the Southwest, the earthworks along the Ohio River. But they didn't build extensive underground networks. They didn't construct tunnel systems that crossed hundreds of miles. They didn't leave chambers whose engineering would challenge modern construction crews. That's the story. The tunnels don't tell the same story. If you're listening to this to drift off to sleep, that's exactly what this is here for. Let your eyes go heavy. Let the day loosen its grip. And let me take you somewhere strange and dark and fascinating, somewhere beneath the surface of the country you think you know, into a world that was already ancient when the first Europeans set foot on this continent. Because the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. Let's start in the Pacific Northwest, because that's where some of the most persistent reports come from, and because the geography there makes the idea of ancient tunnel systems not just plausible but almost logical. The Cascade Mountains are volcanic. The entire range from northern California up through Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia is a chain of volcanic peaks sitting over a geologically active zone where tectonic plates are grinding against each other, thousands of feet below the surface. And volcanoes, as any geologist will tell you, are natural tunnel makers. When lava flows in the outer crust cools faster than the interior, it creates what are called lava tubes. These are essentially hollow passages left behind by flowing magma, and they can be enormous. Some of the lava tubes in Hawaii are large enough to drive a truck through. Some of the tubes in Iceland are wide enough to hold entire tour groups. And in the Pacific Northwest, lava tubes have been mapped that stretch for miles through the basalt bedrock beneath the Cascades. The Ape Cave, near Mount St. Helens in Washington state, is one of the most famous. It runs for nearly 2.5 miles underground, formed about 2,000 years ago when a lava flow from Mount St. Helens left behind a hollow passage as it cooled. It is a natural formation. Geologists have studied it thoroughly. There is no mystery there. But here is where things become interesting. When Native American elders of several Pacific Northwest tribes were asked about the caves in their oral traditions, the caves they described didn't sound exactly like Ape Cave. They described passages that connected the mountains to the coast. They described underground waterways. They described chambers where people had lived, not camped temporarily, but lived, with sleeping areas and fire pits, and storage spaces. And in some accounts they described entrances that had been deliberately hidden or sealed, entrances that their ancestors had closed off, for reasons they no longer fully remembered. In the Itenjobaitishires, a speleologist named Mel Waters began exploring a property he owned in Ellensburg, Washington, and claimed to have discovered a shaft of extraordinary depth on his land, a perfectly circular hole roughly 9 feet across that he lowered weighted rope into for distances, he said, exceeded 15 miles without the rope going slack. The shaft became known in some circles as Mel's Hole, and the claims associated with it are extraordinary enough that professional geologists have largely dismissed the story as folklore or fabrication. But here is what's interesting about Mel's Hole. Regardless of whether the specific story is true, Native American elders from the Yakima Nation, when asked about the area, said that the land where the hole supposedly existed was already considered a sacred and unusual place long before waters arrived. They had stories about that specific piece of ground. They had protocols for approaching it. They had reasons, rooted in generations of tradition, for not disturbing it. You don't develop ceremonial protocols for a hole in the ground that doesn't exist. Something was there. Something the local people had known about for a very long time. Whether it was the specific hole Waters described, whether it was a natural feature, or something constructed, whether the depth he claimed was accurate or wildly exaggerated, the underlying fact is that people had been marking that piece of land as significant for centuries before the story became famous. That pattern, indigenous oral tradition preserving memory of a specific underground location, long before any outsider arrives to document it, is something you encounter again and again when you start researching underground structures in America. It is one of the most consistent threads running through all of these stories. Move east, across the Cascades, across the Columbia Plateau, across the high desert of Nevada, and you arrive at a landscape that looks, on the surface, like it holds very few secrets. The Great Basin is vast and spare and dry. The mountains rise sharply from flat valley floors. The soil is alkaline. The summers are brutal. It is not, at first glance, a landscape where you would expect to find evidence of sophisticated civilization. But the Paiute people who have lived in this region for thousands of years have stories. One of the most famous accounts was preserved by Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, a Paiute woman who published a memoir in Ichen Babai Basha San called Life Among the Paiutes. In it, she recorded oral traditions that described a race of people her people called the Sitaka, whom the Paiute described as red-haired, cannibalistic enemies who were eventually driven into a cave and burned out or sealed inside. The cave in question was later identified as Lovelock Cave in Nevada, a site that was commercially excavated for bat guano in the early 20th century. What the guano miners found, when they started digging, was remarkable. Beneath the guano layer, the cave held evidence of ancient human habitation going back thousands of years. Artifacts, duck decoys, made of chul reeds that were still intact and functional looking. Woven baskets of extraordinary quality. Tools. And among the human remains that were eventually recovered, some individuals had reddish hair. The mainstream archaeological explanation is that the hair color was a result of chemical changes caused by the alkaline environment of the cave, that dark hair can shift toward auburn or red tones under certain burial conditions. This is a legitimate explanation. It happens. But the Paiute oral tradition that described red-haired enemies sealed in a cave predated the discovery of Lovelock Cave by many generations. The oral tradition existed before anyone had excavated the cave and found anything, which means that whatever the ultimate truth of the hair color, the basic claim of the oral tradition that there were unusual people sealed inside a specific cave in this region was correct, and Lovelock Cave was not isolated. The region around Humboldt Sink in Nevada is dotted with caves and rock shelters that show evidence of deep human habitation. Some of those caves connect to each other through passages that are not always obvious from the outside. Some of those passages have never been fully mapped. In the Ichen Jobai Chishas, a local rancher reported that his cattle had fallen into a depression on his property that opened into what he described as a room underground, a large space with walls that looked worked rather than natural. He filled in the depression before anyone with archaeological training could examine it because, he said, he needed the land to be safe for his livestock. Whether the space was natural or constructed, whether the walls were genuinely worked stone or just an unusual rock formation, is now impossible to determine. The depression is gone. The room, if it existed, is buried. This too is a pattern. Underground anomalies in America have a habit of disappearing before they can be properly documented. Sometimes they're filled in by property owners. Sometimes they collapse on their own. Sometimes the people who discover them seal them back up because they're frightened by what they found, or because they feel, for reasons they can't always articulate, that some things are better left alone. Go further east, into the Four Corners region where Utah and Colorado and Arizona and New Mexico meet, and you enter territory that every archaeologist will tell you is the heartland of pre-Columbian North American civilization. The ancestral Puebloans, sometimes still called the Anasazi, built here. They built on cliff faces that seemed to defy gravity. They built towers whose purpose is still debated. They constructed road systems that run arrow straight for miles through terrain that makes road building brutally difficult, roads that go nowhere anyone has been able to identify as a destination. And they built underground. The kiva is the most well-known underground structure of the ancestral Puebloans. Every Puebloan community had them, round or rectangular chambers partly or fully subterranean, entered through a hole in the roof, used for ceremonial and community purposes. The kiva was the center of spiritual life. It was also, in some communities, the center of practical life. A gathering space, a place for weaving, a place for councils. But the kivas that most tourists see at Mesa Verde or Chaco Canyon are the small, community-level structures. What fewer people know about are the Great Kivas, and fewer still know about what lies beneath and between the Great Kivas. Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico is the ceremonial center of the ancestral Puebloan world. The great houses there, Pueblo Bonito, Chetroquetl, Casa Rinconada, were built with a sophistication of planning that still impresses modern architects. The walls are built with a double-shell construction technique that was not rediscovered in Western architecture until centuries later. The buildings are oriented to solar and lunar events with a precision that required not just careful observation, but extensive mathematical calculation. And they are connected, through a system of roads, to dozens of outlier communities spread across a region the size of several modern states. Those roads have been studied extensively. What is less studied is what runs beneath the roads. Archaeological surveys conducted at Chaco in the 1870s using ground-penetrating radar identified anomalies beneath the canyon floor that were interpreted as possible subsurface structures. Some of those anomalies were later excavated and turned out to be storage chambers, buried rooms, hidden caches of material. Some of the anomalies were not excavated. Some of the anomalies were large enough that the researchers noted they were larger than anything the Chacoans were known to have built on the surface. There is a feature at Chaco that local Navajo people have referred to for generations as the Underground Road. They say it runs from the great houses at Chaco to a specific sacred site in the mountains to the east. They say it is not a metaphor. They say it is a physical passage, underground, and that in the past, people who knew the way could travel from Chaco to the mountains without ever appearing on the surface. No archaeological team has found this passage. No tunnel has been mapped connecting Chaco to the mountains. But the road system that runs on the surface from Chaco, the roads that modern archaeologists have documented using aerial photography and satellite imagery, is itself deeply strange. The roads run perfectly straight for miles. They don't curve around obstacles. They don't follow the natural contours of the land. When they encounter a cliff face, they sometimes run straight up the cliff using carved handholds and footholds rather than detouring around. They appear to have been built for reasons that went beyond simple transportation, because some of them lead to places that don't have populations, don't have resources, don't seem to have any practical destination. Some researchers have suggested the roads were ceremonial, that the act of building and maintaining a perfectly straight road was itself the point, that straightness was a sacred quality in the Chacoan cosmology, a physical expression of the path between the human world and the spiritual world. If straightness was sacred, and if the surface roads were the visible expression of that sacred geometry, it raises a question that nobody has directly answered. Was there an underground component? Was the visible road paired with an invisible one? Did the people who built these extraordinary surface structures also build downward? In the limestone country of the Ozarks, across Missouri and Arkansas and into Oklahoma, there is a different kind of underground world. Limestone dissolves. Water moving through limestone over thousands of years creates karst topography, a landscape riddled with sinkholes, springs, caverns, and passages that connect to each other in ways that surface geography doesn't predict. The Ozarks have some of the most extensive cave systems in the world, hundreds of known caves, thousands of miles of mapped passages, and below the mapped passages, hydrologists believe, is another world entirely, a deep karst zone where water moves through passages that no one has ever entered. The indigenous peoples of the Ozarks, the Osage among them, have stories about people who lived underground, not temporarily, not in caves used as seasonal shelters, people who had established themselves beneath the earth in a more permanent way, who moved through the underground landscape the way surface people moved through forests and valleys. In the 1920s, a Missouri schoolteacher named Lena Crockett reported stumbling into an unmarked cave on a hillside near her home and descending into a system of passages that eventually opened into a large chamber with a floor of smooth stone. On the walls of the chamber were images, carved or painted, she was never sure which, because her lamp was giving out and she was frightened, and she didn't stay long enough to look carefully. She reported the cave to local authorities. Local authorities came and looked and found the hillside. They found what appeared to be the entrance she had described, a narrow gap in the rock. But when they crawled through, they found only a small natural space, a few feet deep, ending in solid rock. No chamber, no carvings, no passages. Either the chamber had been deliberately sealed between Crockett's visit and the authorities' visit, or Crockett had found the entrance from the inside of the hillside, and the entrance was somewhere else, somewhere the search party hadn't looked, or Crockett had been mistaken about what she found. She maintained the story for the rest of her life. She described the carvings in consistent detail across 40 years of retelling. She drew sketches of the images she had seen. The sketches showed imagery that is consistent with what researchers now recognize as Southeastern ceremonial complex iconography, a system of symbols shared across a vast geographic area of the American Southeast and Midwest during the Mississippian period, roughly 900 to 1500 years ago. She couldn't have fabricated that detail because the Southeastern ceremonial complex wasn't fully documented by archaeologists until after her death. She either saw something real, or she somehow absorbed information about Mississippian iconography through channels that are themselves hard to explain. Neither option is comfortable. The Mississippian culture is one of the most extraordinary and least understood civilizations in North American history. At its height, between roughly Babai and Yitianliu by CE, it stretched from the Gulf Coast north to the Great Lakes and from the Atlantic seaboard west to the Great Plains. It was not one unified civilization in the way that Rome was one civilization, but it was a network of communities connected by trade, by shared religious iconography, by shared architectural traditions, and by something that archaeologists call the Southeastern ceremonial complex, a system of sacred objects, symbols, and practices that appears across the entire network. The center of the Mississippian world, its largest city, its most complex ceremonial site, was Cahokia. Cahokia sits across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis, in what is now southwestern Illinois. At its peak, around Echene by CE, Cahokia had a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people, making it larger than contemporary London. It covered an area of 6 square miles. It contained over 120 earthen mounds, some of them among the largest pre-Columbian structures in the Western Hemisphere. The largest mound at Cahokia, Monk's Mound, is bigger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises 100 feet above the surrounding plain. It was built in stages over several centuries, with each stage of construction carefully planned and executed. The soil used to build it was brought from specific locations that researchers have been able to identify through soil analysis, locations spread across miles of the surrounding landscape, chosen deliberately for specific soil properties. This is not a pile of dirt. This is an engineered structure, built by people who understood soil mechanics, who planned across generations, who organized the labor of thousands of people across centuries of sustained construction effort. And then Cahokia was abandoned. Around 1500 CE, the population of Cahokia collapsed. Within 100 years, the great city was empty. No war, no catastrophe, no external invader appears to have driven the population away. The people simply left. And they left quickly enough that they left things behind. Pots still containing food, tools laid down as if their owners intended to return, personal items that people wouldn't abandon if they had time to plan an orderly departure. Where did they go? The descendants of the Mississippian people are likely found among several modern tribes, the Osage, the Quapaw, the Chickasaw, among others. But those tribes, when asked about Cahokia, sometimes describe it as a place that was left for reasons that go beyond simple practical explanations. They describe it as a place where something happened, something in or beneath the mounds, something that made the city untenable. Archaeologists have found evidence of extensive subsurface activity at Cahokia beyond the mounds themselves. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified anomalies in the flat areas between the mounds, areas that on the surface appear to be ordinary ground, but underground show patterns consistent with buried structures, buried passages, buried chambers. Some of these anomalies have been excavated. Some have been found to contain post holes and floor surfaces, evidence of structures that were built, used, and then deliberately demolished, their debris pushed into the ground. Others have not been excavated. Some of the larger anomalies remain unexplored because the logistics of full excavation are expensive and time-consuming, and because the area is a World Heritage Site, where excavation requires extraordinary levels of documentation and oversight. Beneath Monk's Mound itself, beneath the largest earthwork in pre-Columbian North America, there are anomalies. Geophysical surveys conducted in the Etienne-Jobai Joshua's Ease identified what appeared to be a large enclosed space within the lower body of the mound, a space that was not the result of natural settling or erosion, but appeared to be a deliberate construction, a void that had been engineered into the mound during its building. Excavation of Monk's Mound has been limited. The mound is enormous. Full excavation would take decades and enormous resources, and there is, among the researchers who study Cahokia most closely, a certain reluctance to fully open the mound, a reluctance that some scholars attribute to practical concerns about preservation and others attribute to something less easy to name. Something is in there. Something was built into the heart of the largest earthwork in North America, and we don't know what it is. The indigenous oral traditions of the Midwest consistently describe underground spaces associated with the mounds. The Osage describe places where the ancient ones kept things. Not just objects, not just stored goods, but things of power. Things that were dangerous to the uninitiated. Things that required specific knowledge and preparation to approach safely. The Cherokee have traditions about underground passages that connect specific sacred sites. The Choctaw describe a subterranean world beneath the mounds where the spirits of the dead resided and where certain ceremonies required participants to descend, symbolically or literally. Most archaeological interpretations treat these oral traditions as metaphor. The underground world of the spirits is understood as a cosmological concept, not a literal description of physical space. The passages and chambers in the stories are understood as narrative devices, ways of describing spiritual journeys in spatial terms. But that interpretation assumes that the people who preserved these stories for hundreds of generations were either speaking entirely in metaphor about places that didn't physically exist, or that they had forgotten the literal truth and preserved only the symbolic shell. And that assumption may be wrong. There is a growing body of archaeological evidence suggesting that some Mississippian mounds contain genuine subterranean features that are not fully explained by the mound-building process. Features that look less like accidental voids and more like intentional constructions. Features that correspond, in some cases, surprisingly precisely, to the locations described in specific oral traditions as entrances or sacred spaces. This doesn't prove that the oral traditions are literal accounts of real physical structures, but it raises a question worth sitting with. When people tell the same story about the same specific place for 500 years sender, when investigation of that place reveals physical anomalies that correspond to the story, at what point does it become reasonable to take the story seriously as a description of something real? Move south from the Mississippian heartland, down through Tennessee, and into the deep, forested limestone hills of Alabama and Georgia, and you enter another zone of persistent underground mystery. In Etienne-Jobai, a man named Don Patton began documenting reports of large human bones found in cave systems across the American Southeast. This is a story that has been thoroughly entangled with religious controversy and scientific skepticism, because Patton's work was motivated in part by creationist beliefs, and many of his specific claims have been challenged or dismissed by mainstream archaeologists. So take what follows with that context in mind, but strip away the interpretive framework, strip away the claims about biblical giants and pre-flood civilization, and what remains are documented accounts, some of them going back to the 19th century, of human remains found in cave systems across the southeast that were anomalous in ways that mainstream explanations don't fully account for. Remains that were larger than expected, remains found in contexts that suggested organized burial rather than accidental death or animal activity, remains that were associated with objects, tools and ornaments and materials that didn't fit the expected cultural context for the site. The Smithsonian Institution is frequently cited in these discussions, and the citations are sometimes accurate and sometimes wildly distorted. What is true is that the Smithsonian conducted extensive excavations across the eastern United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that the collections from those excavations are enormous, containing hundreds of thousands of objects and remains that have never been fully catalogued or published. It is also true that some of the reports from those early excavations, published in the Bureau of American Ethnology annual reports, describe finds that are genuinely puzzling, remains and objects and site configurations that the excavators themselves noted as unusual or unexplained. Some of those annual reports are available in full online. If you read through the reports from the Itembabai Bashares and Itembabai Joshares, you will encounter, scattered among straightforward descriptions of pottery types and mound stratigraphy, occasional passages where the excavator stops and essentially says, "We found something and we're not sure what it means." Those moments are not the focus of the reports. They're not highlighted. They're buried in the middle of dense descriptive text. But they're there. What the Smithsonian's early excavations did not find, did not document, and did not report says nothing about what might exist in the many cave systems and underground spaces across the southeast that were never excavated at all. The karst topography of Alabama and Tennessee and Kentucky is as complex as anything in the Ozarks. There are cave systems in this region that have been known to local people for centuries and that have still never been fully mapped. There are passages that go down and down into the limestone and eventually reach water tables and underground rivers where no surface team has ever followed. In those unmapped passages, anything could be waiting. Kentucky is home to Mammoth Cave, which is the longest known cave system in the world, with over 400 miles of surveyed passage and an unknown additional extent that speleologists continue to map every year. The official discovery of Mammoth Cave by European Americans dates to the late 18th century, but indigenous peoples had been using the cave for thousands of years before that. Mummified remains, called the cave mummies, were found deep inside Mammoth Cave in the early 19th century. These were people who had died in the cave, in some cases deep inside the cave, in passages far from any natural entrance, in total darkness. The question of how they got there and why has never been fully answered. The mummies were found in positions and locations that suggested they were not accidental deaths. Some were found in postures that looked like burial preparation. Some were found with grave goods. Some were found in places that are genuinely difficult to reach, even with modern lighting. Places where any ancient person would have been moving through absolute darkness, with only the most primitive illumination. They knew the cave well enough to go deep inside it in the dark. They knew it well enough to navigate passages that twist and branch in ways that would be completely disorienting without prior knowledge. Either they had been in the cave many times before, mapping it through repeated exploration, or they had been taught its layout by people who had mapped it before them, and they are not the only mummies. Across the cave systems of the American Southeast and Southwest, mummified human remains have been found in underground contexts that raise similar questions. Not just people who died in caves, but people who were placed in caves, brought deep inside, arranged with deliberate care, surrounded with objects. People for whom the underground was not just a shelter, but a destination. What were they doing in the dark? The most widely accepted explanation is funerary practice. The caves were sacred places associated with the underworld, and placing the dead inside them was a way of committing them to that world. This is a reasonable explanation. It fits with what we know of Mississippian cosmology, which had a clear three-part structure: the upper world of the sky, the middle world of the living, and the lower world beneath the earth. Burying the dead in the lower world is cosmologically consistent, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the people found in positions that suggest they were moving through the cave when they died, not placed there after death. It doesn't explain the evidence of repeated use in some cave locations, fire rings, tool deposits, organic debris that accumulated over what appears to be many visits, rather than a single burial event. It doesn't explain the passages that lead down from known Mississippian sites into cave entrances that appear, based on soil chemistry and artifact distribution, to have been used regularly, not just for burial, but for something else. For whatever happened in the dark, repeatedly, over centuries, in the limestone underworld beneath the Mississippian cities, there is a site in Tennessee that I want to tell you about, and I want to be careful in how I tell it, because the details are well documented, but the interpretation is genuinely uncertain. The site is called Bat Creek Mound, and it was excavated by the Smithsonian's Cyrus Thomas in Ichembabe Bashajo. Thomas found, beneath the mound, a burial context containing 9 skeletons. With one of the skeletons was a small stone tablet inscribed with characters. Thomas identified the characters as Cherokee. The inscription was published as Cherokee in the Bureau of American Ethnology annual reports in Ichembabe Bashajo. The stone sat in the Smithsonian's collection for nearly a century. In Ichembabe Bashajo, a researcher named Corey Cyrus looked at a photograph of the inscription and noticed something unusual. He showed it to Semitic language scholars. They identified the characters not as Cherokee, but as Paleo-Hebrew, specifically a script used in the ancient Near East during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. The inscription reads, according to their translation, either for the land of Judah or for Judea. The stone has been tested. The burial context has been analyzed. The results are genuinely contested. Some researchers point to evidence of contamination and argue that the stone was a post-excavation plant introduced into the collection fraudulently at some point between Ichembabe Bashajo and Ichembabe Bashajo. Others point to the soil chemistry and argue that the inscription was genuinely found where Thomas said it was found, in an undisturbed, pre-Columbian burial context. I am not going to tell you what the Bat Creek stone means. I don't know. No one knows with certainty. But I am going to tell you that its existence raises a question that the standard historical model of pre-Columbian isolation doesn't have a comfortable answer for. If the stone is genuine, if it was genuinely found where Thomas said it was found, in a burial mound in Tennessee that predates European contact, then someone in pre-Columbian North America was using a script from the ancient Near East. How and what else did they bring with them? And what does this have to do with tunnels? Maybe nothing, but maybe something. Because the same region of Tennessee where Bat Creek Mound was found is threaded through with cave systems, and those cave systems connect to each other through passages that extend deep underground and emerge in unexpected places. And the people who used those caves left traces, left marks, left evidence of activities that mainstream archaeology has not yet fully explained. The underground world of the American Southeast is not empty of human history. It is full of it. It is just that most of that history has been removed from sight, either by time, or by water, or by deliberate human action, or by the very human tendency to seal off things that are difficult to explain and move on to something else. Go west now, back across the Mississippi, west of the plains, into the land that Americans call the Southwest, but that its inhabitants called home, into the red rock country of Utah and the painted deserts of Arizona and the canyon systems of New Mexico, into the landscape that tourists come to see the surface of, the arches and the mesas and the ancient cliff dwellings perched on ledges 1,000 feet above the valley floors. Below the surface of this landscape, carved by millions of years of water moving through sandstone and limestone, is another world entirely. The Colorado Plateau sits on top of a geological formation called the Kaibab Uplift, and beneath the Kaibab Uplift, water has been working for so long that the cave systems are among the most extensive in the Southwest. The Grand Canyon itself is a kind of three-dimensional cross-section of these underground water systems. When you look at the Grand Canyon walls and you see the horizontal banding of different rock layers, you are looking at a vertical record of time, each layer representing millions of years of geological history. And running through those layers, if you know where to look, are the dark openings of caves. The caves in the Grand Canyon walls are not secret. Park visitors can sometimes spot them from the rim or from the river below. But what is inside those caves, what the Grand Canyon conceals behind its cliff face openings, is much less well understood than the canyon itself. In Lingzhou, a story appeared in the Arizona Gazette newspaper that became one of the most enduring and contested legends in American underground mythology. The article described a discovery by a man named G.E. Kincaid, who claimed to be a Smithsonian-affiliated explorer, of a cave in the Grand Canyon walls that contained an extraordinary complex of passages and chambers. According to the article, the cave extended hundreds of feet into the cliff and contained artifacts of Egyptian or Tibetan character, mummified remains, hieroglyphic inscriptions, copper weapons, a large idol, and passages that extended deeper than the explorers had been able to follow. The story was never confirmed. The Smithsonian has no record of a G.E. Kincaid. The Arizona Gazette article has been shown to have journalistic characteristics consistent with the sensationalist newspaper hoaxes that were common in the early 20th century. The mainstream archaeological consensus is that the story was fabricated or at least dramatically embellished. And yet, the area of the Grand Canyon that the article described as the location of the cave corresponds to a section of the canyon walls that contains genuine caves that have genuinely not been fully explored. The National Park Service limits access to the canyon's interior and to its cave systems, partly for safety reasons and partly because the caves contain archaeological materials that are protected under federal law, and that the Park Service does not have the resources to fully document and protect if the caves are opened to general access. In Lingzhou, a National Geographic team using modern scanning technology surveyed sections of the Grand Canyon walls and identified multiple subsurface anomalies, voids within the rock that were larger than could be explained by the known cave systems. Some of those anomalies were in exactly the portion of the canyon described by the Lingzhou newspaper article. This doesn't prove the Lingzhou article was true. The anomalies could be natural voids with no human component whatsoever. The geological history of the Grand Canyon includes many processes that create enclosed spaces within the rock without any human involvement. But the anomalies are there. And the area they're in is the area where, according to a story that has circulated for over 100 years, someone once found something extraordinary in the dark. The Hopi people, who have lived on and near the Colorado Plateau for over 1,000 years, have an origin story that describes their ancestors emerging from the underground world through a place called the Sipapu. In most Hopi accounts, the Sipapu is a symbolic location, the navel of the earth, the point of connection between the lower world and the middle world of human life. In the Great Kiva at Chaco Canyon, there is a physical Sipapu, a small hole in the floor that represents this connection. But some Hopi elders, speaking carefully, have suggested that the symbolic Sipapu is not the only Sipapu, that somewhere in the canyon country of the Colorado Plateau, there is a physical place where the underground world connects to the surface world, a real passage, a real entry point into what they call the lower world. They will not say where it is. This is not evasion. This is deliberate protection of a sacred location, the same kind of deliberate protection that has kept certain indigenous sacred sites hidden from outsiders for generations. Sites that researchers know exist but can't find because the communities that know their location have made a collective decision not to share that knowledge with people who might not handle it appropriately. This protective secrecy is frequently interpreted by outsiders as proof that the sites don't really exist, that the refusal to share the location is evidence of the story's purely metaphorical nature. But that interpretation gets the logic backwards. You don't protect the location of things that don't exist. You don't develop elaborate cultural protocols for maintaining the secrecy of a metaphor. You protect real places, because real places can be damaged by the protocol's wrong kind of attention. The fact that Hopi elders will not tell outsiders where the physical Sipapu is does not mean the physical Sipapu doesn't exist. it means they don't trust outsiders with that information, which, given the history of how outsiders have treated indigenous sacred sites in America, is a completely reasonable position. Let me tell you about the tunnels beneath the cities, not beneath the wilderness, beneath places that have been built up, paved over, built upon again, where the ground has been disturbed by a century or more of modern construction, and where anything ancient should have been found, documented, and either preserved or destroyed long ago. San Francisco was built on a peninsula that experienced massive earthquake activity in its geological past. The soil beneath parts of San Francisco is fill, material dumped into the bay to extend the buildable land area, and beneath that fill is the original geology of the peninsula, rock and soil that existed before the city arrived. And in that original geology, there are cave systems. Some of them are mapped. Some of them have been incorporated into the city's underground infrastructure in ways that most San Francisco residents don't know about. In the early 20th century, during the construction of various civic buildings and transit lines, workers encountered underground passages that they couldn't explain. Some of these encounters were documented in construction records. Some were sealed off and never mentioned again. One account, from a Yitian-Jobai Yishar construction project in the area near Market Street, described a passage of cut stone, not natural rock formation, but dressed stone, laid in a pattern consistent with deliberate construction, found at a depth of 30 feet below the existing surface. The passage extended in two directions beyond the excavation zone. No one followed it. The construction project continued, and the passage was sealed within the interns. Excavation. Who built a stone passage 30 feet below what would become Market Street? The area where San Francisco stands was inhabited before European arrival by the Alone people, who built primarily in perishable materials, who are not known from the archaeological record to have constructed underground passages. The Spanish arrived in the 18th century and built missions and presidios on the surface. No Spanish colonial records describe underground construction. The stone passage documented in the Yitian-Jobai Yishar construction records has no obvious explanation. Los Angeles has a more famous set of underground legends, centered on the city's extensive network of tunnels that were built during Prohibition for illegal alcohol transport, and that expanded over the decades into a complex unofficial underground city used by various marginalized communities. These tunnels are real, documented, and in some cases still accessible. They are not mysterious in the sense that their builders and their purposes are unknown. But beneath the Prohibition tunnels, beneath the documented unofficial underground, workers have occasionally encountered older passages, passages that predate the city, passages that predate the Spanish missions, passages whose stone has been weathered and whose walls show evidence of use over long periods of time. In the Yitian-Jobai Sanchez, a Los Angeles geologist named G. Warren Shufelt claimed to have used a device of his own invention to map a system of tunnels beneath downtown Los Angeles. He said the tunnels were laid out in a pattern resembling a large lizard, with a head, a body, and a tail, and that they connected a series of rooms, some of which he believed contained gold. He obtained a permit from the city of Los Angeles and began drilling a shaft to reach the tunnels. He found passage. He found evidence of worked stone at depth. He did not find gold. And then, for reasons that are still unclear, he abandoned the project. His equipment was removed. The shaft was filled, and the city of Los Angeles announced that the tunnels had been found to be merely natural cave formations and that there was nothing of archaeological significance. 3 of the city council members who had been briefed on the findings said nothing further about the matter for the rest of their political careers. The Hopi people, when told about Schufelt's tunnel mapping, recognized the lizard pattern. It corresponded, they said, to a figure in their own tradition, associated with underground passageways and with a particular period in their ancestral history, when their people were moving through the underground world before emerging onto the surface. Whether this correspondence is meaningful or coincidental is impossible to say, but the Hopi had no reason to have known about Schufelt's tunnel map. And yet the pattern he described matched something in their tradition. There are tunnels beneath San Antonio, Texas, that city officials have known about for decades and that the public has been mostly unaware of. Some of these tunnels are documented as Spanish colonial constructions, passages built beneath the missions for reasons that include defensive routing, water management, and simple movement between buildings during periods of conflict. Some of these tunnels connect to the river system in ways that would have been useful for a colonial settlement under siege. But some of the passages encountered during the construction of San Antonio's modern infrastructure predate the Spanish missions. They were found below the colonial layer in soil that contains no Spanish colonial material, only material that archaeologists date to the pre-contact period, and in some cases to periods much earlier than the contact-era indigenous occupation. In 2001时, a sewer maintenance crew working beneath a section of downtown San Antonio encountered a passage that their equipment identified as anomalous. They called in a supervisor. The supervisor called in the city's archaeological compliance officer. The compliance officer documented a passage of unknown age and origin, with walls of cut limestone extending beyond the limits of the inspection zone. The passage was documented, photographed, and sealed. The documentation was filed with the city. It has not been published. This is not unusual. Archaeological compliance documentation from infrastructure projects is routinely filed and rarely published. The information is available to researchers through public records requests, but it doesn't circulate in public discourse because it's buried in filing systems that most people don't know to search. How much unknown underground archaeology is sitting in municipal filing systems across America, documented and filed and forgotten? The honest answer is a lot. Urban archaeology in America is consistently underfunded and undervalued compared to the logistical and financial demands of the infrastructure projects that generate the archaeological compliance requirements. Things get found, minimally documented, sealed, and moved past, because the alternative, halting a billion-dollar infrastructure project to conduct a full archaeological investigation, is not a realistic option under current legal and financial frameworks. We are building over the underground past of America at a pace that archaeological compliance regulations cannot keep up with. Things are being sealed and forgotten constantly. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural failure of how we manage the relationship between modern development and archaeological preservation. Go to the Northeast now, to New England, where the colonial history is so thick that most people assume anything interesting that exists in the ground must date to after the Pilgrims. But the Northeast has its own underground mysteries, and they are strange enough to deserve careful attention. Scattered across New England, concentrated in New Hampshire and Vermont and western Massachusetts, but found across the region, are stone chambers. Hundreds of them. Some are small, barely large enough for a single person to crouch inside. Some are larger, with corbelled ceilings and carefully laid floors and entrance passages that are oriented to specific astronomical events. Some appear to be deliberately arranged in relationship to each other, positioned within sight of each other, or along sight lines that correspond to celestial alignments. The mainstream historical explanation for these chambers is that they are colonial root cellars. New England farmers of the 17th and 18th centuries, it is said, built these stone chambers for food storage. The corbelled construction technique was brought from Europe. The astronomical orientations are coincidental. This explanation has problems. For one thing, colonial root cellars are documented. We have records of their construction. We have farming accounts and property records and letters and diaries that describe cellars. The stone chambers of New England are not mentioned in any colonial record. They are not associated with any colonial farmstead in any documented way. They appear in the landscape without any written history, which is not something you expect from a structure built by a highly literate community that documented almost everything it built. For another thing, the construction techniques in some of the chambers are not consistent with colonial building practices. The corbelling, the way the stone courses are laid to gradually narrow and meet at the top, follows patterns found in megalithic construction in Ireland and Britain, and Brittany, construction that dates to the Neolithic, to 3 and 4 and 5,000 years before the colonial period in New England. This is the point at which the conversation becomes genuinely contentious, because there is a well-organized school of thought associated with researchers like Barry Fell and more recently with the organization called NERA, the New England Antiquities Research Association, that argues these stone chambers are evidence of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact, specifically of Celtic or Phoenician or Iberian peoples reaching New England before Columbus. This view is not accepted by mainstream archaeology. The mainstream position is that the similarity in construction technique is a result of convergent architecture, the same engineering problem being solved in similar ways by different cultures independently. But here is what the convergent architecture argument doesn't address: the astronomical alignments. Not all of the New England stone chambers are aligned to anything, but some of them, a significant subset, are oriented with their entrance passages facing precisely toward the rising sun at either the winter solstice or the summer solstice or the cross-quarter days, the midpoints between the solstices and equinoxes that were important in both indigenous North American and Celtic European calendrical systems. An accidental colonial root cellar doesn't have an entrance passage oriented to the winter solstice sunrise. That's not a feature that serves any agricultural storage function. The orientation serves only one purpose. It means that on the specific morning of the winter solstice, a shaft of light enters the chamber and illuminates the interior in a way that doesn't happen on any other day of the year. This is deliberate. Someone deliberately positioned that entrance to create that effect, and the question of who did it and when and why does not have a satisfying mainstream answer. The most interesting chamber in New England, and possibly the most thoroughly studied, is at a site called Mystery Hill in Salem, New Hampshire, now known as America's Stonehenge, though it has no demonstrable connection to the real Stonehenge. The site consists of a complex of stone structures arranged across several acres of hilltop, including chambers, standing stones, and what appears to be a large flat stone with channels carved into it that some researchers have identified as a sacrificial altar, though the more prosaic explanation is that it was a lye leaching stone for soap production. The site has been occupied and modified by multiple people over multiple periods, which makes it extremely difficult to date or attribute. It was owned in the 19th century by a man named Jonathan Patee, who likely built or modified some structures on the site. Before Patee, the site appears to have been used by various indigenous peoples. And before that, the dating evidence becomes genuinely puzzling, because some of the stone at the site has been dated through thermoluminescence and radiocarbon analysis of associated organic material to periods that predate any known colonial or indigenous occupation. Some of the dates are ancient. Some dates from the site cluster around Lingxia BCE, 2,000 years before the Common Era, 4,000 years ago, in a period when, according to the standard historical model, the only people in New England were indigenous peoples living in ways that left no stone architecture. Either the dates are wrong, or the standard historical model is incomplete, or some other explanation exists that no one has yet formulated. The chambers connect to each other through passages. Some of the passages are mapped. Some of them extend beneath the surface of the hill in ways that the surface structures don't obviously predict. And some of them, according to people who have spent time inside the site, seem to continue beyond the mapped extent into darkness that no official survey has followed. In the hills of Ohio, there are earthworks. You probably know the most famous ones, the Great Serpent Mound, an effigy earthwork in the shape of a serpent that stretches over 1,300 feet across the landscape, whose head aims precisely toward the summer solstice sunset. The Newark earthworks, a complex of geometric enclosures covering 4 square miles, whose circular component is aligned to the lunar cycle with a precision that requires 18 years of observation to detect. The Fort Ancient Complex, the Hopewell earthworks scattered across southern Ohio. These are the visible structures, the ones above the surface. They are extraordinary enough on their own terms, but what lies beneath them is less well documented. The Hopewell culture, which built the most elaborate of the Ohio earthworks between roughly eBay BCE and Ube CE, also built underground. Their burial mounds contained carefully engineered subsurface chambers, log-lined tombs of extraordinary complexity, some of them large enough to have served as permanent structures rather than simple burial containers. In some cases, these chambers appear to have been in use for extended periods before being sealed, with evidence of multiple entries and activities over time. And the earthworks themselves, the geometric enclosures and the roads that connect them, appear in some cases to continue underground. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Newark earthworks have identified subsurface features that don't correspond to the surface geometry, buried walls and enclosed spaces that are oriented differently from the surface structures above them, as if there are two layers of construction at the site, one visible and one hidden. The Hopewell people were remarkable traders. Their artifacts are found across an enormous geographic area, and those artifacts include materials from sources that should have been completely outside their reach. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, grizzly bear teeth from the Western Plains. All of this traded, transported, and transformed into ceremonial objects at sites in Ohio, which is not geographically close to any of these source locations. How did they do it? How did a people who left no written records coordinate trade networks spanning half a continent? The answer that most archaeologists give is that the Hopewell interaction sphere, which is the term used for this continental-scale trading network, was maintained through periodic ceremonial gatherings at sites like Newark, where people from across the continent came together, exchanged goods and information, conducted ceremonies, and maintained the social relationships that kept the network alive. This is plausible. It's consistent with how other pre-state societies have maintained long-distance networks. But it raises a question about infrastructure. Did the people traveling to Newark from the Rocky Mountains and the Gulf Coast and the Appalachians have routes? Did they have established paths, maintained passages, underground shelters along the way? The Hopewell roads are another underpublicized feature of the Ohio earthwork complex. Like the Chacoan roads of the Southwest, the Hopewell roads run straight for miles, connecting earthwork complexes to each other across the landscape. They are visible in aerial photographs. They are genuinely there, and like the Chacoan roads, they go to places that don't have obvious practical destinations, and they continue straight through terrain where a sensible modern road would curve. If the underground component of the Chacoan system might exist, might the Hopewell system have a similar underground dimension? Is there something beneath the straight roads of Ohio that corresponds to what might be beneath the straight roads of New Mexico? No one has looked seriously. The earthworks are protected. The ground between them is mostly private agricultural land, where systematic geophysical survey would require landowner cooperation and significant funding. The question hasn't been asked in a form that generates research money and permits, but the question is there. Here is something that ties together many of these separate threads. In 2012, a team of researchers working on a geophysical survey project in the Ohio River Valley, near a site called Poverty Point in Louisiana, identified a pattern of subsurface anomalies that extended over a much larger area than the surface archaeology of the site suggested. Poverty Point is one of the oldest and largest earthwork sites in North America, built roughly 1760 years ago by a culture that lived in a period when the standard model says agriculture-based civilization was not yet present in North America. Poverty Point was built by hunter-gatherers, people who gathered wild foods and hunted animals, and who, according to the standard model, should not have had the social organization or surplus labor to construct earthworks on the scale of Poverty Point. But Poverty Point is real. The mounds are real. The organized geometric pattern of the site is real. The evidence of long-distance trade is real. And the subsurface anomalies identified in the Liangtianling Isha survey are real anomalies that suggest the surface structures are only part of what was built at Poverty Point, that there is a significant underground component that has not yet been investigated. The researchers published their preliminary findings. The findings attracted attention within the small community of scholars who study Poverty Point specifically. And then the funding cycle ended, and the follow-up investigation hasn't happened yet. This is the quiet tragedy of American archaeology. Not a conspiracy of suppression, but a structural shortage of resources combined with an institutional tendency to prioritize confirming what we know over investigating what we don't. The anomalies at Poverty Point are sitting there beneath the Louisiana soil, waiting for a research team with the right equipment and the right funding to come and look at them seriously. And that team hasn't come yet. Let me tell you about water. Underground water is one of the explanations that mainstream researchers reach for most readily when confronted with reports of large subsurface voids in America. The karst topography of the Southeast, the volcanic geology of the Pacific Northwest, the limestone country of the Midwest, all of these landscapes contain extensive natural cave systems carved by water over millions of years. When someone reports an underground chamber or passage and researchers investigate, the first and often most satisfying explanation is that the person found a natural cave. This explanation is frequently correct. Most reports of mysterious underground spaces turn out to be natural formations. This is not surprising. Natural caves are common. They are often genuinely mysterious seeming, and they often contain enough archaeological material from human use over centuries that they can appear to be constructed spaces when they are actually natural ones. But not always. There is a specific signature that distinguishes natural cave systems from constructed underground spaces. Natural caves have irregular cross-sections. Their walls curve and vary in ways that reflect the irregular movement of water through rock over time. Natural caves have dripstone formations, stalactites and stalagmites, and flowstone, features created by mineral-laden water that persist for thousands of years. Natural caves have floors that slope and undulate and pool in ways that reflect the action of water. Constructed underground spaces have regular cross-sections. Their walls are flat or regularly curved. Their floors are level. Their passages maintain consistent dimensions over their length in a way that natural water action doesn't produce. When workers or explorers report underground spaces with flat floors and straight walls and consistent passage dimensions, they are not describing natural caves. They are describing constructed spaces. The reports that contain this kind of detail, flat floors, straight walls, consistent dimensions, regular cross-sections, are harder to dismiss than reports of dramatic chambers and mysterious artifacts. They're describing a construction signature that doesn't match any natural process, and those reports, quietly, persistently, keep appearing in the historical record across America. In a Tennessee Creek bed that was exposed during a drought in Eaton-Jobate Sandsha, workers reported finding an entrance to a passage with flat-cut stone walls approximately 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, extending beyond the limit of their willingness to enter it. No follow-up investigation was conducted. The creek refilled when the rains returned. The entrance is presumably still there, below the waterline, waiting. In a Pennsylvania farm field that was deep plowed in U8207, the plow broke through into a void. The farmer lowered himself into the void and found a passage with dressed stone walls extending in 2 directions. He explored one direction for what he estimated as a quarter mile before turning back, because his lamp was running low, and because, he told his neighbors, the passage was going somewhere he hadn't expected, and he wanted to think about it before going further. He filled the hole in his field, intending to come back with better equipment. He never did. The field has been farmed continuously since then. In an Arizona canyon that was the subject of a flash flood in Eaton-Jobate-Lushabar, the flood exposed a passage cut into the canyon wall that a park ranger photographed before the next flood covered it again. The photographs show a passage with a flat floor and walls that appear to be finished stone, not natural rock face. The photographs are in the National Park Service archives. They have been examined by several researchers. No follow-up investigation of the specific site has been conducted. These are 3 examples. There are dozens more, quietly documented, minimally investigated, filed away. The question that I keep returning to is not whether the tunnels exist. Enough documented evidence points to underground construction of unknown origin across enough of the continent that the existence question is, to me, largely settled. Something is under there. Many somethings in many places, of varying ages and varying levels of construction sophistication. The question I keep returning to is who. The standard framework for understanding pre-Columbian North America recognizes extraordinary complexity and sophistication in the cultures it documents. The Mississippians, the ancestral Puebloans, the Hohokam, the Hopewell, the Poverty Point culture, all of these were complex societies capable of remarkable engineering achievements. There is no reason in principle why any of these cultures could not have built underground passages and chambers. In fact, there are specific reasons why many of them would have. The cosmological emphasis on the underground world in most Eastern North American traditions, the ritual significance of caves and underground spaces in Pueblo culture, the documented Mississippian use of caves for ceremony and burial, all of these suggest not just that underground construction was possible, but that it was desirable, that the people who built these surface monuments had strong cultural and spiritual motivations for also building downward. The question is not whether they could or would. The question is what, specifically, they built, and where, and how far it extends, and what it contains. And the answer to that question is not in the academic literature, not in any complete form, because the systematic underground archaeology of North America has not been done. The surface has been surveyed. The mounds have been excavated. The cliff dwellings have been mapped. But the ground beneath the surface, beneath the mounds, beneath the valleys between the cliff dwellings, has not been systematically investigated with modern geophysical tools. When it is, what will we find? I think we will find that the underground dimension of pre-Columbian North American civilization is substantially larger than anyone currently imagines. I think we will find that the people who built Cahokia and Chaco Canyon and Newark also built downward, that the above-ground architecture we marvel at was only the visible portion of a built environment that extended into the earth. I think we will find that some of the oral traditions that describe underground passages and chambers are not metaphor but memory, preserved across centuries and generations by people who knew what their ancestors had built. I think we will find things that we don't currently have good explanations for, things that fit within the framework of known pre-Columbian cultures, but push the boundaries of what we currently attribute to them. And perhaps, in some places, things that don't fit that framework at all, things that require a more radical revision of our understanding of what happened in North America before Europeans arrived. I could be wrong about the scale, I could be wrong about what the investigations will find, but I am fairly confident that the underground archaeology of North America is a largely unexplored field that will produce extraordinary results when it is properly investigated. And that investigation has not yet begun in any serious way. There is a man named David Hatcher Childress who has spent decades documenting reports of underground spaces in America. His work sits at the contested border between serious alternative archaeology and popular sensationalism, and he is not universally trusted by mainstream researchers, but his documentation is extensive, and some of what he has gathered corresponds closely to reports from other independent sources. One of the things he has consistently emphasized is the pattern of deliberate concealment, not just the natural concealment of time, erosion burying entrances, vegetation hiding openings, flood deposits sealing passages, but active, deliberate concealment by human hands. Entrances that appear to have been sealed from the inside. Passages that show evidence of careful fill, not the random fill of debris accumulation but organized fill, the kind of fill that results when someone with a purpose and a plan deliberately closes a space. Why would the builders of underground spaces deliberately seal their own constructions? There are practical reasons. Sealing a chamber that contains sacred objects protects those objects from being disturbed. Sealing a passage that was used for initiation ceremonies maintains the mystery and power of the ceremony by ensuring that only those who know the alternative entrance can access it. Sealing an entrance that has become dangerous due to structural instability or flooding or predator activity is simple safety management. But in some cases, the sealing appears to have happened in a hurry, in a way that suggests not planned closure, but emergency closure. Passages sealed with whatever material was available, not with the careful, prepared fills of deliberate ritual closing, but with the improvised fills of people who needed to close something quickly and didn't have time to do it properly. What were they closing themselves off from? Or what were they sealing inside? The question sounds dramatic, and I don't intend it in a purely dramatic way. The practical answers are real answers. Sealing dangerous animals inside, sealing unstable sections of tunnel system, sealing areas where water intrusion had made access impossible. But the patterning of the evidence, The way some of these hastily sealed passages appear in sites that were themselves abandoned quickly, the correlation between the underground sealing and the surface abandonment of places like Cahokia suggests something more than routine maintenance decisions. The people who sealed these passages and then left their cities knew something was wrong. Something underground had changed. Something that made staying untenable, that made closure necessary, that required departure in a hurry. We may never know what that something was, but the physical evidence of rapid departure and rapid sealing is real, and it points toward an event, or a series of events, that our standard archaeological framework doesn't yet have room to accommodate. Let me bring you back to the surface for a moment. One of the most persistent questions about pre-Columbian North America is the question of connectivity. How connected were the various regional cultures? The standard model acknowledges trade connections between major centers, recognizes the Mississippian interaction sphere and the Hopewell interaction sphere and the Chacoan influence zone, but treats these connections as essentially surface phenomena, people moving goods and ideas along overland routes or river systems. But what if some of that connectivity was underground? What if, in certain critical corridors, the major cultural centers of pre-Columbian North America were connected by underground routes? Not tunnel systems thousands of miles long, that's genuinely implausible given the engineering constraints, but local underground systems, passages that covered the 10 or 20 or 50 miles between a major center and its nearest neighbors, that allowed movement of people and information without visibility from the surface. The sacred significance of underground space in essentially all Eastern North American traditions provides a cultural motivation. The cosmological emphasis on the underground world, the ritual importance of the connection between upper and lower worlds, the practice of conducting the most sacred ceremonies in underground or partially subterranean spaces, all of this suggests that building underground was not just engineering but theology. Building a passage between two sacred sites, underground, invisible from the surface, accessible only to those with specific knowledge, is precisely the kind of action that fits the documented spiritual framework of Mississippian and Hopewell and ancestral Puebloan culture. And the engineering capacity was there. The people who built Monk's Mound, who transported millions of tons of carefully selected soil to construct a platform taller than a 10-story building, could certainly have organized the labor to build an underground passage. The people who built the great houses of Chaco Canyon, whose walls are engineered to standards that modern architects recognize as sophisticated, could certainly have built underground. The people who carved elaborate geometric earthworks across 4 square miles of Ohio landscape, with precision that required years of astronomical observation to achieve, could certainly have built passages. The capability was there. The motivation was there. The cultural framework supported it, and, in some ways, demanded it. What's missing is the documentation, and the documentation is missing because we haven't looked. Beneath the American Southwest, there is a hydrological system that modern engineers have been trying to fully understand for decades. The aquifers of the Colorado Plateau, the underground water systems of the Sonoran Desert, the subsurface drainage patterns of the Great Basin, all of these are interconnected in ways that surface geography doesn't fully predelineate. Water moves through this underground system along paths that were partly natural and partly, in some cases, shaped by human activity. The Hohokam, who lived in what is now central Arizona from roughly Sambak CE to Ichen Sibai Wusha CE, were engineers of extraordinary skill. Their surface canal system, which moved water from the Salt and Gila rivers to irrigated agricultural fields across a network that eventually exceeded 1,000 miles of maintained canals, represents one of the most complex pre-industrial irrigation systems in the Western Hemisphere. We can see the canals from aerial photographs. We can trace their routes. We know they worked because we know the Hohokam supported large populations in an area that, without irrigation, would support very few. What we know less about is what the Hohokam built underground along their canal system. They certainly built underground storage systems. They certainly built covered sections of canal to reduce evaporation in the brutal desert heat. And there is evidence, in some sections of the Hohokam cultural landscape, of subsurface features that are not obviously part of the surface canal system, but that appear to be hydraulically connected to it. Were there underground canal sections? Underground passages associated with water management? Underground chambers at critical hydraulic nodes in the system? The Sonoran Desert is a difficult place to do archaeology. The heat is brutal. The distances are vast. Access to many parts of the Hohokam landscape requires significant logistics, and the modern development that covers Phoenix and Tucson and their surroundings has destroyed or buried large sections of the Hohokam cultural landscape beneath streets and buildings and foundations. Some of what's beneath the modern cities of the Southwest was found during construction and documented minimally before being built over. Some of what's there was never found at all. And some of what's there is in areas that haven't been developed yet, in desert sections of the Sonoran landscape, where the soil still holds its secrets because no one has had a reason to dig. The Pima and Tohono O'odham people, who are descended from the Hohokam, have oral traditions about underground spaces associated with their ancestors. They describe places where the ancient people stored things, places where certain ceremonies were conducted below ground, places that in some cases they still know the location of and still approach with appropriate ceremony. Like the Hopi with their Sipapu, the Tohono O'odham don't share the specific locations of these places with outsiders. The reasons are the same: protection of sacred sites from inappropriate attention, maintenance of the cultural protocols that govern access to powerful places, trust, or more specifically, the absence of sufficient trust toward outsiders who might not treat the sites with appropriate respect. I find myself, when I think about this protective secrecy, feeling a kind of respect for it that makes me reluctant to push against it in the way that some researchers do. The impulse to find these places, to document them, to publish about them, is an impulse that comes from a certain Western tradition of knowledge being public and shared. But that tradition has not been good for indigenous sacred sites. Every site that has been publicly documented has also been disturbed by treasure hunters, vandals, and enthusiastic amateurs whose intentions were good, but whose impact was not. The sites that remain protected by secrecy are also the sites that remain intact. Maybe some things should stay underground. Maybe the tunnels that the indigenous peoples of North America are protecting are better protected by their silence than by our investigation. Maybe the work of documenting and explaining and publishing is not always the most important work, but the curiosity remains, the questions remain, and the physical evidence, the anomalies in the ground-penetrating radar data, the sealed passages found during construction, the oral traditions pointing to specific places with specific physical features, all of that remains too, waiting for the right approach, the right relationship, the right moment. There is one more place I want to take you before we surface. In the mountains of North Carolina, in the land that the Cherokee call home, there is a tradition of underground travel that predates the Cherokee arrival in the southern Appalachians and is associated with people they call the Nunahai, sometimes translated as the immortals or the people who live anywhere. The Nunahi in Cherokee tradition are people who live underground and underwater, who occasionally appear to help the Cherokee in times of need, who have their own civilization in the subterranean world that is in some ways more sophisticated than what exists on the surface. The Cherokee are explicit that the Nunahi are not supernatural beings in the way that angels or demons are supernatural. They are people. They are human. They live underground by choice or by ancient circumstance, not because they are spirits, but because that is where they have made their home. Modern Cherokee scholars have interpreted the Nunahi in various ways. Some see them as a cultural memory of earlier peoples who lived in the region before the Cherokee arrived, peoples whose culture and technology were different from the Cherokee's own. Some see them as a spiritual concept, a way of describing the presence of the sacred in the landscape. Some maintain the literal interpretation that the Nunahai are real people, living underground, accessible through specific entrances that the Cherokee know about and approach with ceremony. In the mountains of North Carolina, in the karst limestone of the southern Appalachians, there are indeed extensive cave systems. The region has caves that are genuinely deep, genuinely complex, genuinely unmapped in their full extent. The Appalachians are geologically old, and old mountains have been worked on by water for a very long time. producing underground drainage systems of extraordinary extent. Whether any of those cave systems contain what the Cherokee describe as the world of the Nunnehi chambers and passages used by a people who live underground in an organized way is impossible to say from the outside. What can be said is that the landscape is physically capable of containing such spaces, that the Cherokee oral tradition is specific and detailed in its geographic references, and that no systematic investigation of the specific cave systems referenced in Cherokee tradition has been conducted. The mountains hold their secrets. The limestone is patient. Whatever is inside the hills of North Carolina has been inside for a very long time, and it is in no hurry to reveal itself. As you feel yourself drifting now, as the story softens and the day loosens further, let me bring you back to the beginning, to the idea that underneath your feet right now, wherever you are listening from, the earth holds more history than any book has recorded. The underground world of pre-Columbian North America is not a marginal topic. It is not the province of cranks and conspiracy theorists and people who see mysteries where there are none. It is a genuine archaeological frontier, a domain of physical evidence and documented anomalies and ancient oral traditions that the mainstream discipline has not yet given sufficient attention. When that attention comes, when the technology is applied systematically, and the resources are found, and the research is done with the care and respect that these sites and these traditions deserve, what we learn will change the story. Not because we will find that the standard story was entirely wrong. The Mississippians were real. The ancestral Puebloans were real. The Hopewell culture was real. Their engineering achievements on the surface are extraordinary and not in doubt. But we will find that the story was incomplete, that the civilization that produced Cahokia and Chaco Canyon and Newark also built downward, into the earth, into the dark, into the cosmological underworld that their traditions described as real and sacred and inhabited. And we may find things that go beyond the known cultures entirely, anomalies that don't fit the standard framework, passages that predate the cultures we know, evidence of connections and continuities that the standard model of pre-Columbian isolation doesn't accommodate. These findings will be uncomfortable for some people, and they will require careful, rigorous investigation before any conclusions can be drawn from them. But they will not be easily dismissed, because the physical evidence, when it is properly gathered, doesn't disappear when you look away from it. The tunnels are there, some of them natural, some of them constructed, some of them natural spaces, shaped and modified by human hands over long periods of time. Some of them holding objects and materials and remains that have been waiting in the dark for someone to come with good questions and careful hands and the patience to learn what they have to teach. And some of them protected, guarded by traditions that have kept their locations secret for generations, that have maintained the ceremonial protocols that govern their access, that have watched outsiders come and go with their theories and their equipment and their publications, and have decided, quietly, that the cost of sharing is higher than the benefit. Those tunnels may never be found by outside researchers. Their locations may go to the earth with the last elders who know them. And maybe that is not a tragedy. Maybe some knowledge is better kept underground. Maybe some places are more powerful for being unknown. Maybe the mystery itself is the point. The way that the underground world in so many North American traditions is the source and destination of life, present beneath everything, accessible only to those with the right preparation and the right intentions, never fully mapped, never fully explained. You can feel the weight of the earth above you now, feel the depth of it, mile after mile of rock and soil and ancient passage, layer upon layer of geological time, and threaded through it, here and there, in places you would never expect, the marks of human hands, stone laid flat on stone, a passage carved through rock, a chamber sealed and waiting, a floor worn smooth by 10,000 feet, beneath the cities and the plains and the mountains and the deserts, beneath the careful surface of the country you think you know, something old is resting, patient as limestone, patient as water, patient as the dark itself. It has been there for a very long time. It will be there a while longer. And when you wake in the morning, if you remember any of this, you might find yourself wondering, just for a moment, as you put your feet on the floor and feel the solid ground beneath them, what lies below? What passages run under the soil beneath your house? What chambers exist in the rock beneath your city? What the earth knows that the surface has forgotten? The tunnels are there. Somewhere they are there. And they are waiting, in the dark, for someone patient enough to find them. Rest now. The underground world is old and it is not going anywhere. There will be time, in the daylight, for questions. Tonight, let the earth hold you from below and the dark hold you from above, and let the stories settle into your sleeping mind like water finding its way through limestone, slow and certain, following paths that have always been there, moving toward a place no surface map has ever shown. Sleep well. The tunnels can wait. But before sleep fully takes you, there is more to tell. Because we haven't talked about the coast. We haven't talked about what lies beneath the shorelines, beneath the bays and the sounds and the barrier islands, beneath the drowned landscapes that were dry ground when the ice sheets were full and sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. The last ice age ended roughly 12,000 years ago. When the ice melted, the water that had been locked in glaciers for tens of thousands of years returned to the ocean. Sea levels rose, slowly at first, then rapidly, as the great ice sheets of the northern hemisphere collapsed. The rise was not uniform and not steady. It happened in pulses, periods of slow accumulation interrupted by sudden accelerations when major ice masses broke apart and sent enormous quantities of meltwater into the ocean in short periods of time. During the peak of the last ice age, sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than they are today. This means that the current continental shelves of North America, the shallow underwater zones that extend for miles offshore before dropping into deep ocean, were dry land. And that dry land was inhabited. We know this because the artifacts have been found. Fishing hooks, stone tools, animal bones with cut marks, human remains. All dredged up by fishing boats and research vessels from the continental shelves of the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, from depths of up to several hundred feet, from materials that date to the period before the coastal flooding. The continental shelves of North America were inhabited landscapes, and they were flooded. The people who lived there either moved ahead of the rising water, or they didn't. Some of their settlements are now under the ocean, and some of those settlements may have been substantial. On the Atlantic coast, the area that is now called the Outer Banks of North Carolina, the chain of barrier islands that runs along the coast, was once the inland shore of a much wider coastal plain. The barrier islands themselves are the remnants of what were once inland dunes, sand formations that are now out in the ocean because the ocean has risen around them. Between the current barrier islands and the current coast is a shallow sound, and beneath that sound is the drowned landscape of the old coastal plain. What was on that coastal plain? We don't fully know because systematic underwater archaeology of the Atlantic continental shelf is expensive and logistically demanding and underfunded. What we do know, from the materials brought up by fishing nets over the decades, is that people were living on that plain. Their artifacts are in the sediment beneath the sound and beneath the shallow shelf. Their settlements, if they built permanent ones, are there too. If those settlements had underground components, had cellars or storage chambers or ceremonial spaces dug into the sandy coastal soil, those underground spaces may be the best preserved parts of their sites. Solid underground construction survives the disruption of flooding better than surface structures. The surface buildings would have collapsed and dispersed, but an underground chamber, especially one sealed with stone, might survive. No one is systematically looking for underground chambers in the drowned landscapes of the Atlantic coast. The technology exists to do this. The same ground-penetrating sonar systems that are used for other underwater surveys could, in principle, identify subsurface anomalies on the continental shelf. The work simply hasn't been prioritized. Move up the Atlantic coast, and you find something that has been documented more extensively, but is still poorly understood: the network of stone structures along the New England and maritime Canadian coast. In addition to the inland stone chambers of New Hampshire and Vermont, there are stone structures along the coast itself, structures that are now partly underwater, that extend from the low tide zone into the offshore zone, that appear to be organized in ways consistent with deliberate construction, but that mainstream archaeology has not definitively attributed to any specific culture. Some of these structures are likely colonial fish weirs, the stone traps built to catch fish at low tide that were common in colonial and post-colonial New England fishing communities. Fish weirs are simple, practical, and many of the coastal stone structures are almost certainly this. But some of them are more complex than fish weirs. Some of them are underwater chambers, stone-walled enclosures that would have been above the waterline when they were built and that are now partially or fully submerged. Some of them extend inland, connecting to onshore stone structures through passages that are intermittently accessible depending on tide and weather conditions. A marine archaeologist named James Whittle documented dozens of these coastal stone structures in the Etsenjobite 2S and Etsenjobite Barshes S, and his documentation showed a pattern that troubled him. Some of the structures appeared to be older than any colonial attribution could account for. Some of them were built in ways that were more sophisticated than fish weirs required, and some of them connected to passages that extended underground, passages that were above the current water table at low tide, but that were below water for most of each tidal cycle. Were these underwater passages natural? Were they constructed? Were they natural passages that were shaped and modified for human use? Whittle couldn't answer the question definitively, and subsequent researchers haven't resolved it either. What is certain is that the New England coast, now and in the recent historical period, is full of stone that has been placed by human hands in patterns that don't always have straightforward explanations. And some of that stone is underwater, and some of that underwater stone is organized into passages that lead somewhere that is only accessible at certain tidal conditions, somewhere that the people who built these structures knew how to reach and that we have largely forgotten. The Great Lakes are fresh water, not salt water, and they have their own drowned landscapes. When the ice sheets retreated from the Great Lakes region roughly 10,000 years ago, the water levels in the lakes fluctuated dramatically for thousands of years before settling into something approximating their current levels. During some periods, the lakes were higher than they are now. During others, they were lower, exposing parts of the current lake bed as dry land. In Lake Huron, in a section called the Alpena Amberley Ridge, archaeologists have found stone structures on the lake bottom that appear to be ancient hunting blinds and drive lines, structures used to direct caribou toward hunters during the period when the lake bed was dry land, roughly 9,000 years ago. The structures are clearly human-made. The material record around them includes caribou bones, stone tools, and evidence of repeated use over many centuries. The discovery of organized stone structures on the bottom of Lake Huron was genuinely surprising. It shouldn't have been, because the logic of drowned landscapes applies to the Great Lakes just as it applies to the coastal shelves. But it was surprising because no one had really looked. What else is on the bottom of the Great Lakes? Systematic survey of the Great Lake beds for archaeological material is in its earliest stages. The technology for underwater survey has improved dramatically in recent decades. The cost of deploying that technology over the enormous areas of the Great Lakes is substantial but not prohibitive, and the potential for discovery is significant because the Great Lakes Basin was inhabited by complex societies for thousands of years, and the fluctuating water levels of the post-glacial period created cycles of exposure and flooding that may have repeatedly drowned inhabited landscapes. The Hopewell culture, which we discussed earlier, was centered in Ohio, which is bordered by Lake Erie. The people who built the Newark earthworks had access to Lake Erie and to the river systems that drain into it. Some Hopewell artifacts found at inland sites show evidence of association with lake resources. The relationship between the Hopewell world and the Great Lakes is not fully understood. If the Hopewell built along the lake shores, and if the lake levels were higher during the Hopewell period than they are now, some of their lakeshore construction may be underwater, including, possibly, the underground components of their architecture. I want to go back to something I touched on earlier, the question of deliberate concealment, and I want to push a little further into it. The pattern of sealing and concealment that appears in the underground archaeology of North America is consistent enough to demand explanation. Not just the natural processes of time and geology, not just the accidental filling of abandoned spaces, but deliberate human action to close off underground spaces in ways that suggest intention. There are three contexts in which this pattern appears, and they are different enough from each other that they probably reflect different motivations. The first context is ritual closure. In many North American traditions, underground sacred spaces are periodically sealed as part of their sacred function. The space is used, the ceremony is concluded, and then the space is closed off, not abandoned but deliberately put away, like a ceremonial object that is wrapped and stored between uses. The kiva at Chaco Canyon shows evidence of this kind of periodic closure and reopening across multiple generations of use. Some burial chambers in the Midwest were sealed with elaborate care after the burial was completed, and the sealing was itself a ritual act, as much a part of the ceremony as the burial. This kind of sealing is understandable and predictable, and it doesn't carry any particular mystery. The mystery is in what's inside, but the act of sealing is routine. The second context is protective sealing. This is what happens when a space is sealed because accessing it is becoming unsafe, or because the community that uses it is moving and doesn't want what's inside to be found by others, or because something has changed about the relationship between the community and the space that makes ongoing use inappropriate. Some of the rapidly sealed passages I described earlier, the ones where the fill is improvised rather than carefully prepared, fit this category. Something changed. The community needed to close the passage quickly and thoroughly. What changed could be anything from a structural collapse to a flooding event to a political situation that made the space's location a security risk. The third context is the most difficult to talk about because it's the most speculative and because it's the context that tends to attract the most sensationalist interpretation. The third context is emergency sealing. Passages sealed in what appears to have been genuine haste, in circumstances where the normal protocols for closure were abandoned in favor of speed. Passages sealed with whatever was available, in ways that suggest the people doing the sealing were frightened or pressed for time or both. Emergency sealing doesn't fit most of the conventional explanations for site abandonment. If you're moving camp because the resources in an area are depleted, you take time to close things properly. If you're abandoning a ceremonial site because the community has moved, you close it according to the ceremonial protocols that govern such closures. But if something unexpected happened, something that required everyone to leave immediately, something that didn't give the community time to follow the normal protocols, you close things however you can and you go. The abandonment of Cahokia, which I described earlier, has this character. The evidence suggests rapid departure rather than planned relocation. The evidence of underground sealing at Cahokia, where some of the subsurface anomalies show fill patterns consistent with emergency rather than ritual closure, fits this character too. What happened at Cahokia around Ichen Sambai CE that made the largest city in pre-Columbian North America non-viable? The standard explanations, resource depletion, political collapse, climate instability, are real factors in site abandonment and probably contributed to the decline of Cahokia over the longer term. But they don't explain the apparent rapidity of the final abandonment, and they don't explain why so many things were left behind. The underground sealing, if that's what it is, suggests that whatever drove the final departure was not something the inhabitants of Cahokia wanted others to find. Either what was underground needed to be protected from whoever was coming, or what was underground had become dangerous in some way that made leaving it accessible a bad idea. We don't have enough information to know which. We may never have enough information to know which. But the physical evidence is pointing toward a story that the standard model of gradual decline and dispersal doesn't fully tell. Let me tell you about the copper. The Great Lakes copper industry of pre-Columbian North America is one of the oldest and most extensive examples of organized metal working anywhere in the world. Between roughly Liu Qi BCE and Ichen Lianbai BCE, people living around the upper Great Lakes, particularly around Lake Superior where copper occurs naturally in nearly pure metallic form, were mining, processing, and distributing copper on a scale that is genuinely astonishing. Estimates suggest that hundreds of millions of pounds of copper were extracted from the Lake Superior Basin during this period, the Old Copper Complex, as archaeologists call it. Where did it go? Some of it is accounted for. Copper artifacts from the Old Copper Complex have been found across an enormous geographic area of eastern North America. Copper spear points, copper knives, copper tools of many kinds, copper ornaments. They show up in archaeological sites from the Gulf Coast to the Canadian Shield, from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains. The distribution is remarkable because it demonstrates a trade network operating across thousands of miles for thousands of years. But the distribution doesn't account for all of the copper. By any reasonable estimate, the amount of copper extracted from the Lake Superior mines vastly exceeds the amount of copper that has been found in the archaeological record of the region. There is a significant discrepancy, a large quantity of extracted copper whose destination is unknown. Where did it go? One possibility is that much of it was recycled, recast and remade so many times over thousands of years that the original Lake Superior copper ended up in forms and contexts that archaeological analysis can no longer trace to its origin. This is a reasonable possibility. Another possibility is that large quantities of copper were stored in ways and places that haven't yet been found, cached, hidden, placed underground in locations that the people who placed it there expected to return to, or that they sealed away deliberately so that others couldn't access it. The oral traditions of the Ojibwe, who have lived around Lake Superior for centuries, describe places where the old people stored things underground. Not just copper, but knowledge and objects and things of power, stored in specific places in the earth by people who knew what they were doing and intended for those places to remain sealed until the right time. Are there sealed caches of old copper complex material somewhere in the Great Lakes Basin? Almost certainly not in the dramatic quantities suggested by the discrepancy, because the simplest explanation, that the copper was recycled into forms we can't trace, is probably largely correct. But the oral traditions suggest that some material was deliberately stored, and the caves and passages of the Great Lakes Basin are not fully explored, and the lake beds themselves have not been systematically surveyed. The copper may be waiting somewhere, in the dark, in the cold, in the earth beneath the lakes, or the earth beside the old mining sites, or in passages that the miners cut underground to access the ore, and then sealed when downed freed in the downed. They were done. The Lake Superior copper mines themselves are extraordinary. The ancient pits, the places where copper was extracted in antiquity, are still visible on the Kievan Peninsula. They are some of the oldest documented mines in the Western Hemisphere, and the mining that created them was sophisticated. The miners used heat to crack the rock, drove wooden wedges into fissures, and soaked them with water to expand them, used stone mauls and hammers, organized their extraction systematically over many generations. This was not casual surface collection. This was organized industrial mining. Industrial mining produces underground passages. The process of following a copper vein into the rock creates tunnels, shafts, chambers. The old copper complex miners were underground. Their mines are partially preserved, partially collapsed, partially flooded over the millennia since the mining stopped. What those underground passages contain beyond the evidence of mining activity has never been fully documented. There is a feature of American mythology, if you can call it that, the mythology of the underground, that cuts across indigenous and non-indigenous traditions in ways that suggest something real underlies it. The idea of a civilization beneath the surface, of people living underground in an organized way, appears not just in Native American traditions, but in the folklore of European settlers, in the stories that Appalachian communities tell about their hills and hollers, in the legends that persist in certain mining communities about what the miners found when they went deep enough, in the coastal traditions of New England fishing villages about what the lobster boats sometimes bring up from the miners' fishing bottom, in the desert stories of the Southwest about what travelers have found in the canyons. This underground civilization mythology is not monolithic. It doesn't tell a consistent story. The underground people of Appalachian folklore are different from the Nunnehi of Cherokee tradition, which are different from the Sitakar of Paiute legend, which are different from the Little People of Great Plains tribal tradition, which are different from the giant inhabitants of the Southeast cave stories. These are not the same story told by different people. They are different stories, arising in different places, pointing toward different specific experiences and traditions. But they share a structural similarity. They all describe organized human habitation underground. They all describe people who chose or were forced into the underground world. They all describe a relationship between the underground inhabitants and the surface world that involves both separation and occasional contact. And they all treat the underground world not as a metaphor or a spiritual concept, but as a physical reality, a place where things happen and where people live. When that many independent traditions, arising in that many different places across that larger geographic area, independently describe the same general phenomenon, the weight of evidence points towards something real being described. Not necessarily the same thing in every case, not necessarily consistent in its details, but something that multiple independent human communities across North America actually experienced and preserved in their traditions. People were living underground, in organized ways, in specific places, and some of those places, those specific underground habitations, are still physically present in the earth, even if the people who lived in them are long gone. There are researchers operating outside the mainstream of academic archaeology who have spent their lives pursuing the underground history of North America. I am not going to name most of them because the field is contentious and the naming tends to distract from the evidence by triggering debates about personalities and credibility. But the work is there, documented in self-published books and independent journals and online archives that mainstream scholars don't typically cite. Some of this work is speculation dressed as research, and I am not asking you to take it at face value. But some of it is careful documentation of physical evidence, site measurements and photographs and soil samples and geological analyses that deserves more engagement from mainstream archaeology than it receives. The problem is structural. Academic archaeology operates within an institutional system that rewards publications in peer-reviewed journals, and peer-reviewed journals set research agendas based on what has previously been published in peer-reviewed journals. New areas of inquiry that don't have an existing literature base are difficult to introduce into this system because reviewers evaluate new claims against existing knowledge, and if the existing knowledge doesn't include similar findings, new findings tend to be interpreted as errors rather than discoveries. This is not a conspiracy. It is an institutional dynamic that is well understood by people who study how science operates. New paradigms always face resistance from the existing paradigm. The resistance is often appropriate because most new claims that challenge existing knowledge are wrong, but the resistance can also persist longer than the evidence warrants. And in those cases, things that are genuinely true get excluded from the mainstream for periods that, in retrospect, look embarrassing. The underground archaeology of North America may be in that position. There may be findings in the independent literature that deserve mainstream engagement and are not receiving it, not because the mainstream has examined the findings and determined they are wrong, but because the mainstream hasn't examined them at all, because they arrived outside the channels through which mainstream scholarship evaluates new claims. When the mainstream eventually engages with these findings, as it will, when the geophysical surveys get funded and the radar gets deployed and the sealed passages get opened with proper documentation and care, the conversation will change. Findings that have been dismissed because they came from outside the establishment will be revisited. Some of them will turn out to have been right. The underground world of North America is real. Its documentation is incomplete. Its full extent is unknown. And the people who have been trying to document it for decades, outside the mainstream, with inadequate resources, and without institutional support, have been working in the dark, figuratively and sometimes literally. Their work will be part of what lights the way when the full investigation finally begins. I want to close with the stars, not because stars have anything directly to do with tunnels, but because the relationship between the underground and the astronomical in North American traditions is too strong to ignore. The same cultures that built downward into the earth also oriented their architecture towards specific astronomical events. The same societies that had elaborate traditions about the underground world also had elaborate traditions about the sky world, and the connection between the two is not incidental. In the cosmology of the Mississippian culture, the world was organized into 3 tiers: the upper world of the sky, where the sun and the powers of the upper realm resided, the middle world of the living, where human life played out, and the lower world beneath the earth, where the powers of the lower realm resided, and where the dead went after they left the middle world. These 3 tiers were connected. The connection was not metaphorical. The architectural orientation of Mississippian structures towards solar and lunar events was a physical expression of the connection between the middle world and the upper world, and the underground chambers beneath the mounds, The subsurface features that are still being discovered were presumably a physical expression of the connection between the middle world and the lower world. The mounds were not just impressive piles of earth. They were machines for navigating between the worlds. Their astronomical alignments connected the middle world to the sky above. Their underground chambers connected the bays, middle world to the earth below. The ceremony that happened in and around the mounds was the ceremony of connection, the ritual maintenance of the relationship between the three tiers of the universe. This is why the underground mattered so much. This is why people built downward with such care and deliberateness. This is why the underground spaces were associated with the most sacred activities, with burial and initiation, and the ceremonies that required contact with the most powerful forces, because the underground was the lower world made physically accessible. It was the place where you could actually go and experience the connection between the living and the dead, between the surface world and what lay beneath it. And this is why the abandonment of those underground spaces, the sealing and the departure, was so significant. When Cahokia was left, when the great mounds were abandoned, when the underground chambers were sealed, the people who left were not just leaving a city, they were leaving a machine for connecting the worlds. They were leaving the physical structure that had maintained the relationship between the living and the dead, between the human world and the cosmic world, for hundreds of years. Whatever drove them to leave, it must have been extraordinary, catastrophic even, because you don't leave the center of your cosmological world without a very good reason. And the sealing of the underground spaces suggests that the reason was something they didn't want to have to deal with again, something they needed to contain, something they left behind in the dark when they departed. The sealed chambers of Cahokia hold their secrets still. The mounds stand over them, enormous and patient, and the sky turns above them as it always has, and the lower world waits below as it always has, and whatever the Mississippians sealed inside in their hurried departure is still there. In the dark, in the earth, beneath the largest pre-Columbian city in North America. You are almost asleep now. I can feel it in the way the words are reaching you. Softer now, settling rather than pulling. Let the story settle too. Let the underground world recede into that particular darkness that belongs to almost dreaming, where the hard edges of facts dissolve, and what remains is the feeling of a thing, the weight of depth, the patience of stone, the ancient habit of the dark to keep its secrets. The tunnels beneath America are patient. They have been patient for 1,000 years, for 2,000 years, for however long they have been there. They will be patient a while longer. They are not going anywhere. And the people who knew them best, who built them, or found them, or protected them, or sealed them, those people are gone now from the surface, but their traditions remain. Their oral histories persist, carried by communities that have maintained them against enormous pressure to forget, enormous pressure to assimilate, enormous pressure to accept the version of history that says there is nothing extraordinary underground, that the past was simpler than the evidence suggests, that the earth holds nothing we don't already know about. Those communities have not accepted that version. They have maintained the stories. They have kept the protocols. They have guarded the locations. And in doing so, they have preserved, in memory and in tradition, something that archaeology has not yet found in the ground. The meeting between the oral tradition and the physical evidence is coming. It is happening now, in small ways, in the ground-penetrating radar surveys that confirm what elders describe, in the archaeological anomalies that correspond to specific traditional accounts, in the growing recognition within mainstream scholarship that indigenous oral traditions are reliable sources of information about the physical past in ways that Western academic culture has been slow to fully accept. When that meeting is more complete, when the dialogue is fuller and the research is better funded, and the relationships between indigenous communities and archaeological institutions are more grounded in genuine respect, the story of underground America will be told more completely than it can be told tonight. Tonight, it remains mostly underground, mostly in the dark, mostly waiting. The earth beneath you is deep and old and full of things that time has not yet given up. Rest on it gently. Let it hold you. And as you drift into the particular kind of knowing that comes in dreams, let the underground world be there beneath you, patient and dark and full of the accumulated weight of everything that human hands have ever done in the earth. You are resting on top of a history that goes deeper than any history book has measured. Sleep now. The tunnels are there, and they will be there when morning comes. But I realize there is one more place we haven't gone. One more thread that pulls at everything we've discussed tonight, and that deserves at least a few more minutes of your drifting attention before sleep fully takes you. We've talked about the Pacific Northwest and the volcanic geology. We've talked about the limestone karst of the Ozarks and Appalachians and the Great Basin. We've talked about the Southwest and the Four Corners. We've talked about Cahokia and the Hopewell and the ancestral Puebloans. We've talked about the Atlantic coast and the Great Lakes and New England. But we haven't talked about the heartland, about what lies beneath the great flat central zone of the continent, beneath the plains that stretch from Texas to the Dakotas, beneath the tallgrass prairie that covered the center of North America in a vast sea of grass before it was broken by the plow. The plains have a different kind of underground mystery. Unlike the karst country, the plains geology is not riddled with natural caves. The rock beneath the prairie is mostly sedimentary, shale and sandstone laid down in horizontal layers, the accumulated sediment of ancient shallow seas that covered the interior of North America for millions of years. This geology doesn't produce the dramatic cave systems of the limestone country. Water doesn't find the same pathways through shale and sandstone that it finds through limestone. The caves of the plains are smaller and some, as the taking out, rarer than those of the surrounding regions. But there is water underground on the plains, enormous quantities of it, in what geologists call the Ogallala Aquifer. This is one of the largest freshwater aquifers in the world, a vast underground reservoir of water that extends from South Dakota to Texas, and that took thousands of years to fill, mostly during the wetter periods after the last ice age. The Ogallala Aquifer is not a lake underground. It is water trapped in porous rock, moving imperceptibly slowly through the sediment, accessible through wells drilled down to where the saturated zone begins. But here's what the Ogallala Aquifer means for underground archaeology. The water table across the plains has fluctuated dramatically over the past several thousand years, responding to climate shifts that alternated between wetter and drier conditions. During the wet phases, the water table was higher, and the land was more hospitable. During the dry phases, the water table dropped, and parts of the plain became essentially uninhabitable without the kind of organized water management that agricultural civilization requires. The indigenous peoples of the plains knew where the water was. They knew because their survival depended on it, where water could be found underground, where springs emerged, where digging would reach the water table at acceptable depth. And some of them, in some places, built structures associated with water access that went below the surface. In the Texas Panhandle and in parts of eastern New Mexico, there are features called antelope traps, ancient hunting structures that were built to direct game animals into enclosures where they could be taken efficiently. Some of these structures are entirely on the surface, shallow depressions surrounded by low walls of accumulated stone. But some of them have underground components, pits dug into the earth within the enclosure, storage spaces for meat or tools, or in some cases, simply deeper elements of the trap structure itself. These underground components of the antelope traps are not mysterious. They're documented, understood, attributable. But they are evidence of a pattern, even on the plains, where the geology doesn't naturally produce underground spaces. The people who lived there dug downward when they had reason to. And on the plains, there were other reasons beyond hunting traps. The climate of the Great Plains is extreme. The winters are brutal. The winds are fierce. The temperature swings between seasons are among the largest in the world. A people living on the open plains for generations would have strong motivation to find or create shelter from those extremes. Underground shelters, partially or fully subterranean dwellings, are documented across the plains in multiple cultural contexts. The earth lodges of the Mandan and Hidatsa and Arikara people of the upper Missouri River are the most elaborately documented. These were large, circular, partially subterranean structures dug several feet into the earth, their floor below the surrounding ground level, their roof supported by massive timber posts, their walls built up with earth and sod for insulation. Earth lodges were substantial permanent dwellings, warm in winter and cool in summer, and the villages that contained them were major community centers. The earth lodges are well documented because European explorers, including Lewis and Clark, describe them in detail, and because several have been excavated archaeologically. But the documented earth lodges are the tip of the underground dwelling tradition of the plains. The earlier, pre-contact forms of semi-subterranean dwelling on the plains are less well documented, and the degree to which earlier peoples organized their underground living space into something more complex than simple pit houses is a question that hasn't been systematically explored. In the Black Hills of South Dakota, which are geologically anomalous, a dome of ancient igneous and metamorphic rock thrust up through the sedimentary plains, there are genuine caves. The Black Hills cave system includes several well-known caverns that are now tourist attractions, and probably a larger number of caves that are less accessible or less dramatically decorated, and that have received less attention. The Black Hills are sacred to the Lakota and to other plains peoples. They are the center of a cosmology that places this specific upwelling of ancient rock at the heart of the world. The Lakota name for the Black Hills, Pahasapa, translates roughly as hills that are black, referring to the dark ponderosa pine forests that cover the hills when seen from the surrounding plains. But the sacredness of the hills goes deeper than their appearance. It is associated with what is inside them, with the caves and passages within the hills, with the geological otherness of a formation that doesn't belong to the surrounding geology. The caves within the Black Hills have been used ceremonially by multiple generations of plains peoples. Wind Cave, one of the most extensive cave systems in the Black Hills, is associated in Lakota tradition with the emergence of the people from the underground world. The cave is said to be the place where the first people came out of the earth, the sipapu of the plains traditions, the physical connection between the lower world and the middle world. Wind Cave has been partially surveyed. Over 100 miles of passage have been mapped within it, and researchers believe the total extent of the cave is much larger, that the mapped passages are a fraction of what exists within the limestone beneath the Black Hills. The cave is large enough and complex enough that it represents a genuinely unexplored underground world, a world that Lakota tradition says is associated with the oldest and deepest stories of human presence in North America. Whatever is in the unmapped portions of Wind Cave, whatever the passages that haven't yet been followed lead to, whatever might be found in the sections that are too narrow or too flooded or too remote for current survey methods to reach, is still there, still in the dark, still waiting. The Black Hills are the center of the world, in the Lakota understanding, and the center of the center is underground, in the cave where the people first emerged into the light. Maybe that's where to end tonight. Not in the cities, not in the archaeologist's trench, not in the filing system of a municipal government where undocumented discoveries gather dust, but in the cave, in the dark, in the place where tradition says everything began. The underground world of America is not a peripheral curiosity. It is not a fringe topic or a hobbyist's obsession or a conspiracy theorist's playground. It is the other half of the human story on this continent, the half that went down when the rest went up, the half that is still there, still holding the weight of everything that was placed inside it, still waiting for the light and the careful hands and the patient questions that will eventually slowly begin to bring it into view. Sleep now, truly. The work of uncovering is for daylight and patience and proper equipment and right relationships. Tonight is for rest. Tonight is for letting the underground world be underground, letting it keep its darkness and its depth and its extraordinary patient weight of accumulated time. The tunnels are there. The chambers are sealed. The copper may be waiting. The oral traditions are preserved. The geophysical anomalies are in the data files. The discoveries are coming, slower than anyone who cares about this would wish, but coming, and somewhere deep beneath the American earth, in the dark where no one has been for a very long time, the things that were placed there by hands that have been dust for centuries are waiting exactly where they were left, patient as limestone, old as water, silent as the dark that has kept them all this time. You rest above them, and they rest below you. And for this one quiet night, that is enough. The world above and the world below, holding their respective silences, and you suspended between them in the thin, warm layer of the living world, drifting toward the kind of rest that is itself a small and temporary descent into the dark, Go gently. The underground world will hold its secrets until morning. It has held them this long,